Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and I'm joined by Jeremy Freed, who is a postdoctoral teaching fellow in philosophy at Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm so happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, we're talking about your terrific paper, Ally Aesthetics, which came out in 2019 from the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. And in the paper, you take this notion of allyship, or what it is to be a good ally as someone who's outside of a particular social group, and you apply it to the realm of art and aesthetics. And so I think the place to start is with the most basic question of what does it mean to be an ally?
Yeah, so and in the paper, I sort of start with a definition that I take from GLAD, which is just sort of a very general definition that sort of being an ally is just someone in a group with sort of privilege advocating on behalf of someone in other oppressed groups, including, groups based on gender, race, sexual identity, um, ableism, or ability, any of those things. Um, One thing about that though is like the definition starts, it's from 2007, it's an older definition. And I do like go in and complicate it later. So like I do think that being an ally is it's something that like it reads a bit like a title, but it's not that. Like you're not just an ally because you have decided you're an ally, or because you've done something good for someone in a group other than your own like one time. Um, or like even just you want to be an ally isn't enough. It's not something you achieve and then you just are. Like it's not like becoming like getting a PhD and then you're a doctor. Um, for sort of the philosophy minded, I tend to think of it more like in sort of like a virtue sort of sense, like this idea that like to be like virtuous is something that like you're always working towards, and sort of you're just having to take actions, and if those actions are virtuous then like you are meeting that standard, but when they're not, you're not. And so I think being an ally is much more like that. It's something that is sort of a continuous sense of action where you're working on this behalf, and it's something that you don't get to decide for yourself whether or not you're an ally. It's something that is based on what you're actually doing, your intentions, and what the groups that you're working for, what like how they respond to that. You can attempt to be an ally in good faith and fail. So that's sort of my general idea.
Yeah, right. So it takes intention, it takes continuous habitual action, and it requires uptake from whatever group or community you're engaging with, right? Because if they don't
Yeah.
want you, your heart can be in
Yeah.
the right
Or,
place, but you're not an ally.
yeah. Exactly. And you can like it, I think any of us who like want to like be allies, we screw up. Like we make mistakes. And I mean, part of being or like attempting to be a good ally is like admitting those mistakes and trying to do better in the future. So one of the people I sort of talk about in the paper is Dr. Veronica Ivy, who at that time when she published her paper went by Rachel McKinnon, and she sort of has a whole article talking about how people use the idea of being an ally as cover for not having to admit when they don't act very well and when they screw up. And sort of she actually advocates for getting rid of the entire idea of allies. I personally like I see that point, but I'm hopeful that we don't have to do that, that we don't have to resort to that. But I do think that it can be used in a really sort of like it can be used sort of in a gaslighting way, a way to sort of protect yourself rather than admit that yeah, all of us screw up and we are just going to try and do better the next time.
Yeah, right. It can be used in a way to do virtue signaling, or it's merely performative, right? Well, I'm an ally. I'm an ally. And so
Yeah,
therefore anything I say is corrected. So it further allows, I'm an ally, therefore I can speak for them. Right. That's how it
exactly.
often comes across online, I think, especially where it's like, well, you're not a member of that group. Yeah, you may care about them in certain respects, but you can't speak for them. Or as you were saying, it can be a way of social signaling and a virtue signaling. And it's a way of, well, you can't criticize me because I'm an ally. So yeah, I misgender people from time to time, or yeah, I use ableist language now and then, or yeah, I hold these, mildly offensive, racist, or other attitudes, but I'm an ally because I have some friends and I care about them who belong to that group.
Yeah, exactly. So like, yeah, that's not act like at that point, no matter what you call yourself, you're not actually an ally anymore. Like one, especially when you're using it as cover. So like, or just virtue signal. So it's like it's one of those things that it sort of presents as a fairly like simple title, but it's actually a lot more complex than that.
Yeah, and it feels like one of those cases where the more you use that to describe yourself to others, probably the less likely you actually are genuinely an ally.
Yeah, yeah. It's usually better if someone's using that term to describe you than if you're using it to describe yourself. That's a better sign. Just, but that then it's complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in your paper, you take this notion of what it is to be an ally and allyship and apply it to the realm of the arts, right? And of artists through their work attempting to be good allies to help support or defend groups to which they don't belong. And one of the examples you touch on is a very controversial example, which is Dana Schutz's painting "Open Casket," which depicts the photograph of Emmett Till in his casket after he was beaten to death by a group of racist white people. And Dana Schutz is a white artist, and a lot of people in the African American community were super offended because they felt, as you discuss in the paper, that she was appropriating Black pain and Black suffering in a way that she shouldn't have because she herself is not a member of that community. And so, can you talk about that example a bit, and then we can broaden it and discuss other examples?
Yeah, so I talk about that example in partially because like it's an example where we clearly have the record, Dana Schutz, on sort of on the record talking about her motivations, and that like they were really designed to be sort of, and we can. I've had people challenge how sincere she is, but we have no reason or evidence other than sort of inherent distrust of artists to doubt her motivations. That she was like moved by seeing sort of what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, and wanted to sort of and felt that like she could do something as an artist that might help people sort of take note of the way that Black people were being treated in the country. And she's also sort of thought that like she is of an older generation where she knew about Emmett Till, but she felt that like maybe younger people were unaware of this story. And so that through her sort of artwork, she could remind people about this story. So we have her on record with these intentions that seem to at least like to match with being like a genuine attempt at being an ally. So we have that, which is part of why her failure is so interesting. And in the paper, I conclude that she fails because like it's easy to sort of take cases where people are just admit to sort of doing something like a money grab or signaling for just attention. It's easy to see why those people don't make very good allies. But for Schutz's case, part of the problem that I sort of see in what she does is not only does she sort of paint Emmett Till in sort of her own style, but just almost like a cover song of the original painting or the original photograph. Like it is her, like not taking any different perspective. She's stylizing it, but she's using the same basic um, perspective, baby, basically. And that is the perspective of Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till, who asked photographers to take these pictures of her son and distribute them so that people could see what had happened to him. And so Schutz isn't just sort of using sort of this Black historical event or Emmett Till as the subject, but she is specifically taking the perspective that sort of was representative of what Mamie Till was sending out into the world. And I think in doing so, she sort of like that upped the degree to which it seems like she is appropriating something that is just not hers to take. Um, I also think though that part of it is that like she could never explain particularly well why she felt she needed to do that or what she was doing or how this was supposed to be a work of allyship rather than a work of appropriation. She sort of could signal her intent, but nothing about why she did it in the way she did it, why she made the choices that she made. And I think that because for me, on my account, part of, and this is sort of modeled on the idea that to be an ally, that's something that the group that you're attempting to help sort of, they determine whether or not you've done that. That's also true in aesthetic allyship, is that the group that you are advocating on behalf of, if they reject your attempt at allyship, then you have gone wrong. You don't get to decide for yourself that it is a work of allyship, and people outside of that group don't get to decide. And so I think part of what her lack of ability to explain is, and sort of the perspective she took, both of those things contributed to the Black community sort of rejecting her work as something that didn't speak like as an ally, but felt rather that she was co-opting something that she didn't have a right to, which was Mamie Till's sort of perspective on her son.
Yeah, right. And a couple of things there. One is just to sort of tease out a bit what you just said, right? One is that she's a white artist attempting to get a largely white audience to care about Black suffering in the US after the events in Ferguson. Um, but at the same time, she's depicting Black suffering in a way that the Black community largely rejected, right? And a point you make in the paper is an important one, that, you know, the Black community, just like any community, isn't a homogenous mass. There were a
Yeah.
lot of different types of response within the Black community to her work, but by and large, it seemed overwhelmingly negative, that what Schutz had done was appropriate our suffering for her purposes, however well-intentioned they may have been.
Yeah. Certainly, you know, anytime we talk about group response, groups are not monoliths. And there's a whole sort of like area of philosophy trying to deal with how we sort of determine group response. You know, but we don't we don't necessarily have like, you know, an elected representative to rule and sort of give the final ruling on the Black sort of artist response. So instead we're taking our cues from like what we see, and we saw like people like willing to like protest and withdraw works, sign petitions, stand in front of the work to block it. So yeah, this is not to say that there was a universal sort of rejection of the work. I think I talk about Zadie Smith talking about how some of the stylistic choices that Schutz made actually she found quite moving. But I think on the whole, it's a pretty fair sort of analysis of the evidence to say that this work was rejected by Black artists and the Black art world, rather than sort of approved of and taken in.
Yeah. And so, what are some other examples of this phenomenon of, along a similar line of an artist or group of artists trying to be good allies and failing in one form or another to do so?
Yeah, so there's different levels of failure, right? So there's sort of failure of, I mean, because we'll sort of not talk a lot about the people who are just not well intentioned. It's just a cash grab, because like that's, I mean, that's I think maybe a more obvious case of like, well, if you're just sort of not actually doing this for the right reasons, that's going to get in the way of you legitimately succeeding. But you have people who are trying and still failing. So I think one of the sort of more well-known examples, like I like to think about things that people know. Also, they're just easier to talk about. So I think about a movie like Green Book, which won the Oscar, and you have sort of, you know, people making the movie saying like, well, we're just really trying to send this message that, we shouldn't let racial barriers get in the way of our friendship, and that we should treat people as people, and that like you see, this this character played by Viggo Mortensen sort of like initially like he doesn't think of the character played by Marshala Ali as a person. And over the course of the movie, he sort of becomes his friend and comes to know him. And this is supposed to send this message that like we shouldn't judge people based on the color of their skin, but that like we should come to treat people as people. And if you don't, like that you're being sort of racist and problematic. But this movie sort of plays into lots of stereotypes, regarding both sort of racial stereotypes and just cliches within movies. And it's basically just we took Driving Miss Daisy and we switched who was driving the car. There's not a whole lot more going on to it, and it's made by white creators, and the family of I'm forgetting the name of the artist that Marshala Ali plays. The family came out and was like, this is not representative of who this man is. Like, you didn't consult us to talk about our uncle. Like, you left us out of this process. So, like, and like Ali actually sort of apologized. He apparently was under the impression that everyone related to the character he was playing was dead. And so he said if he'd realized they were alive, he would have spoken to them. And so you have this sort of this attempt that like it also though it won Best Picture at the Oscars. So there's clearly a group of people, I think we sort of know based on like the campaigns that have sort of been done, like Oscars So White, that it is largely a white voting bloc for the Oscars, that clearly sort of felt like this message resonates, this movie resonates. But if you look at sort of the response of Black audiences, it's mostly been like, yeah, this just is not it. Like this movie is not speaking to us, and it's playing on stereotypes, and it's not a good example of advocating for Black people. Like that's not what this movie is doing. Like mostly it's advocating for Viggo Mortensen eating things, which can be fun, but is not the same type of message. So
Yeah, no, that's a really good example. And I mean, the Oscars has a history of awarding really didactic, cliched attempts at like promoting racial harmony, Crash probably being
Yeah,
Almost a
Crash is
worse
another.
example. Like I mean, I haven't seen Green Book, but Crash is just a god awful movie. And yet the Oscars
Yeah,
felt like it deserved Best Picture.
yeah. So I mean, I think, and that's, I mean, I think that there's a lot of sort of, and this is sort of why in my account I'm like, we should really look at like, what do the people that this is supposedly sort of trying to do something good for, how do they respond to it first? Because I think that there's a lot of possibility of just white people telling other white people that like this was great. And like we've see like you see that with the Oscars, like, yeah, like you did it, like this was awesome. And then it's like, what was it? Like, is that really the case? And I do, like, this is a concept where I sort of focus on the Schutz case, so it's racial, but I do think that this extends to all sorts of different areas. Like, it's not just sort of racial allyship, it's, allyship in lots of different areas. And so, and like, interestingly, like, when we talk about failed cases, I do think sometimes things can fail outside of things that the artist have any control over. So I think something like in my article, I talk about the song Same Love as a success, um, by Macklemore and Ryan Lewis. I don't know that now in 2024, I would think of that song as a successful piece of ally aesthetics. Um, Given sort of the overhype that that song got, and like the level of importance culture gave to it, I think that it actually sort of undermined sort of the allyistic intent, and it ended up being sort of co-opting some space from other artists, queer artists who could have sort of put that space, taken that space up. And it also doesn't help that pop star Never Stopping lambasted the song fairly well. So also not great for it when it points out all of the ways in which it's not a great ally work. So
That's right. An example that came to mind while you're talking is the film Philadelphia from the 90s, where Tom Hanks plays a character living with AIDS, right? And that film was probably at the time, less so today. I mean, Tom Hanks, I think, has said today that he couldn't have played that role as a straight man, right? But at the time, the movie may not have been made without Tom Hanks being attached to it, and it was, a positive depiction of the HIV AIDS crisis and showing a character living with dignity and not stereotypical. Um, but yeah, I mean, you're getting into issues of, well, with the Macklemore case, like 5 years ago, yeah, good allyship. 5 years later, looking back, maybe not so much because of what happened subsequent with this that's the song.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And like thinking about the Philadelphia case, those are like casting issues remain like a a thing that makes it tough in movies. I mean, and like for because there are people who still like, I think I saw this headline yesterday that Eric McCormick from Will and Grace was like, it should just go to the best actor for the role. It shouldn't depend on the actor's sexuality. But there's also just like, there's a worry, like there's like, there's the historical difficulty for out actors to get roles, particularly roles playing straight characters, such that when straight actors take those roles playing gay characters or queer characters, like it legitimately might be taking like one of the few jobs that a queer actor would actually be seriously considered for off the board. But yeah, we have to think that Philadelphia came out, what, that would have been 30 years ago or so now.
Yeah.
um and so it might have been a pretty successful work at the time, and we might think now that sort of the casting of Tom Hanks is enough to make it not so. I admit I haven't seen it since I was 10 years old, so I haven't rewatched it since I saw it in the theater. So my Philadelphia knowledge is a little bit below maybe what it would need to for me to speak authoritatively on it.
Yeah, right. And one thing we're getting into now is the notion of success, right? Which is central to your account of good allyship in the aesthetic domain, and I think in general, right? That to be successful in part doesn't just mean that the work is good, but that the group of people who you're trying to be a good ally for actually buy what you're doing, accept what you're doing as good for them. And I thought of a couple examples, and I shared at least one of them with you ahead of time, which was the example of Al Jolson, right? When we look back, 100 years later on Al Jolson's work, we find it hugely problematic and hugely offensive, right? He's an artist he's a white artist who's famous for donning blackface, right? For playing
Yeah,
African American characters who are sort of kind, thoughtful, but largely dim-witted, who love their mammy, right? That's one of his most famous songs from that time period was Mammy,
yeah,
right? And he plays this character on Broadway, he plays this character in film, and looking back on it, where we find it offensive and horrifying. Yet at the time period in the 19 teens, 1920s, maybe in the 1930s, the African American audience largely supported what Al Jolson was doing, right? There just weren't roles for Black artists in Hollywood or on Broadway. And so here was a sympathetic portrayal of a Black character who, as it happens, was played by a very famous white artist who was famous for basically minstrel work. Um, and so, it's interesting at the time he was viewed positively by the African community, again, by and large. And yet, a generation or so later, and now 100 years almost later, we're appalled by it that what an artist today could not do what Al Jolson did and be considered a good ally. And so that's getting into like the historical, social, political, sort of contextual nature of the success condition for being a good ally and making good ally art. So that's one example.
yeah. So Al Jolson is a complicated case, right? Like, so on the one hand, we have sort of just the outright sort of offensive nature of his main act. But sort of as you talk about, looking at sort of the historical record, it seems like, at least as was sort of reported in newspapers and things at the time, Black audiences loved the jazz singer. Like, it sold out, they had to extend its run, and like that wasn't just because it wasn't just that, like his next movie had similar sort of response. So it wasn't just the fact that like it was the first, talkie and people were like just there for the novelty of sound. Like, it seems like there was real. So I think from my account, this brings up a couple of different things. So one, it does seem, at least on the evidence, like at the time, the jazz singer or Jolson's work met sort of this minimum sort of first sort of level of success, of being accepted by the audience that you're advocating on behalf of. Now, I think there's some question as to the degree that Jolson's work, like the jazz singer, is actually aimed at any sort of like making people respect and sort of like see Black people as like worthy of respect or any of that. So like whether or not the work is on itself like actually advocating for any sort of ally type sort of understanding of Black people, I think that's pretty open for question.
I mean, I
There's
would just say
certainly
straightforwardly
complicated.
no. Like, I think
So
it's purely exploitative. But I mean, we can assume, just hypothetically,
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
Jolson really was
hypothetically, so
trying
like,
to be an ally. Yeah.
yeah, well then there's the second sort of condition though. Like it's not that's a minimal standard to be met. The second condition is, did it actually do that? Did it actually get white audiences to have understanding? And given that like the evidence suggests that like that's not what he was trying to do, and it doesn't seem like that's what he did, it wouldn't be a successful work of ally aesthetics, even if black people enjoy the movie. Like that's that like it might be a successful work of art on other considerations. Um it might give us reason to pause condemning it outright as like something no one should ever study or anything like that. But I don't think, if it's not actually having that impact on getting people to have this sort of actual greater understanding and respect and care for um, black people, then it's not going to actually be a successful work of ally aesthetics, even if it doesn't fail the first condition. It's just going to like, it's just as a matter of fact not going to be successful, which doesn't mean that Jolson wasn't an ally in other ways.
He probably
His
wasn't.
legacy is like, yeah, I looked into it. His legacy is complicated. Like, apparently, he did like try and hire black actors and like did some supportive things, but also stole their material for his own act. So one of the things where it's like he probably wasn't like, my guess is the black community sort of saw him as sometimes doing some things that were helpful, but he was not a consistent ally at the very least.
Yeah, and in general, I remember watching like an A&E documentary about his life in like the 90s, and apparently everybody hated him. Like he was just a vile human being who alienated everyone
Yeah,
in his orbit.
yeah. I mean, if we held that against our stars, who could we like? I
Who could
mean,
we love anymore? Yeah.
I listen to enough movie stuff where they're like, oh, I think Bill Murray didn't get the Oscar because he's an asshole and no one likes working with him. Like that's why people didn't vote for him, because they don't like him, not because like he wasn't really good in certain movies. It's like, yeah, that might just be something that comes up sometimes. But yeah,
Yeah. And so I mean, I think, for a better example, then we can go back another century, um, to the second most published book in the United States in the 19th century was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? This is
mhm,
a pro-abolitionist novel, right, that intends to portray the humanity of Black characters, of slaves, right? That these people deserve to be treated equally to white Americans. And, again, like wildly successful. Again, there's this second most published and probably second most widely read book in the United States, apart from the Bible, during the 1800s. And yet, the book is responsible for negative stereotypes of African Americans, right? The Uncle Tom character, being chief among them. And yet, again, during this time period, it was successful. It probably helped advance the cause of abolitionism in the United States. And she probably was consulting Black people while writing them. I mean, probably. I'm just speculating here. Maybe
yeah,
she just sort of made all of this up in her head, which if that's the case, then that's problematic. But let's just assume that she was consulting Black Americans while she was writing the novel, and they were largely on board. And so she was dealing with real experiences. She wasn't stealing from people's experiences. She was like getting them to sign release forms, or the 19th century equivalent.
yeah,
Um, and yet again, historically fraught, problematic. Racial stereotypes were advanced unintentionally by this text. And so, how would you analyze that? And clearly, it's not one that works today, right? But during that time
yeah.
period, that seems successful?
Yeah, I mean, so I would analyze it as something that seems like, I think, because I mean, one thing that I think is important, I know I talked about this with, a work as influential as Uncle Tom's Cabin, Same Love by Macklemore and Ryan Lewis. Um, whether or not a work is a success is going to change over time. So I think I would analyze, absent information that I just like I'm not an expert on the book, but like I think that at the time it would be a successful work of ally aesthetics. It's got the right intentions, it's got the right sort of aims, it's accepted by the audience that it's advocating on behalf of, and it has the intended impact. Like it seems to me like Uncle Tom's Cabin was, when it was published, a successful work of ally aesthetics. But one of the things that we sort of note is that, like, and like Paul Taylor has a book on Black aesthetics that, you know, over time, what a work of, and he has like a concept of Black invisibility, and that over time, what constitutes like including Black people is very different. And so, like, when there were just no Black people included, just having Black characters, you're making them visible in some way. And he talked about that as presence. Like, you just have the presence of Black people. But just being present, once that starts to happen, but if there's never a Black person that has like personhood or like they're all stereotypes, well, that's still a type of invisibility. Even though there are Black people included in the work, they're not visible as people. They're sort of more there as sort of background characters, or as just sort of props, or as like stereotypes that reinforce sort of harmful things. And so, well, then if we want to sort of get away from that, then, well, we need to include Black people with personhood, where like they are like legitimately people, where we are sort of getting a sense of who they are and their humanity. But even that, once we get to that level, well, what if we're only ever seeing them like we're seeing them from the gaze of, say, a white savior? um so you've got sort of, yeah, the Black person's a person, but they're never the person who the story is framed around. It's never from their perspective. It's always from the perspective of the main characters, the white characters. We've got, I think of things like the legend of the legend of Bagger Vance.
I was thinking of that too.
Will Smith. It's the Black Caddy, but it's not his. Like, he's there and he's Will Smith, but like he is helping the white person reach their story. And so, yeah, the legend of Bagger Vance, written in 1890, maybe is doing something important by just having the Black character there and giving him personhood. But coming out in the 2000s, really, it's like you're just playing into the magical Negro trope. Like, this is not, like, it's not meeting the standards. And so, like, I think it's actually good that we can say, yeah, when it came out, Uncle Tom's Cabin was doing something important, but as times changed and the focus of it was, now it had these harmful stereotypes, and we're not necessarily, we're not fighting for abolition in 1900. If you read the book, you're getting different things from it. And what it's doing is no longer helping fight for abolition, even though that is still what it did historically. Now it's reinforcing harmful stereotypes. And, the community, and like the Black community could choose to still accept it despite its flaws. That wouldn't necessarily mean that it stays a successful work of allyship, but they can also say, look, this had its time, but now there are features of it that we need to say, like, this is no longer something that we endorse. And I think that's like, I think it's one thing I like about, it sounds really weird to say one thing I like about my own theory, but one thing I like about sort of what I'm trying to capture here is that, like, things evolve, things get messy, things change, and we shouldn't ignore that. We should like respond to that. So, like, I think it's just true that sort of how success, like what Uncle Tom's Cabin did in terms of advocating on behalf of Black people, went from effective to harmful over time. But we can still look at it in its historical place and see the value that it had.
Yeah, great. And presumably then the converse is possible, right? A work that, maybe it's intended to be a work of ally art that's not initially taken up as such or accepted as such by whatever community the artist or artists are trying to be good allies for. But over time, that group comes to accept and embrace it, and then it can be used for the purpose of helping to advance the cause of that group within a wider audience or something of that sort, right? I mean, that has to be possible in your view.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I wish I had a great example of it actually happening at the ready to like throw out there to like, so like not only is it possible, here's where it happened. Um, but yeah, I think, I do think that there are certain things that like things that might be a little bit before their time sometimes, things like that might work in that way. Um, or things where, yeah, it might be that certain, because it's also certain communities sort of change over time. So, what sort of a community embraces as part of the community versus outside the community might also change. But I don't want to throw out an example that I don't actually know the history of. So, like, and like just be wrong about that. So I'm not going to venture into things that are crossing my head that it's like, that could be a possibility, but also I could just be wrong about it. So better not to make any claims that I'm gonna have to be like, Brandon, please take those out of the video.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, when I thought of that question, I didn't have anything in mind either, but other than just to say that, like, it seems like that's absolutely possible on your view. And I think that the point that you made about something being ahead of its time or being not recognized in the way it ought to be recognized at the time, right? That seems correct, right? Or maybe, the thing just,
Yeah,
it wasn't
like
publicized widely enough. It didn't get wide enough attention, and then it sort of grew a cult following over time, and then it got more, maybe not mainstream, but wider success.
yeah, and like you can imagine, certain like I can like this is like I can imagine something that is dealing with sort of maybe trans acceptance that would have been rejected by like the overall sort of like queer audience in maybe like the 80s or 90s that might grow to have acceptance later, because there's sort of a different like a revolving view of necessarily who's included in that group. But also, there's also the reverse where you have people who are, you know, there is, a movement to reject people from certain groups that might also change their views on what's a sort of supportive allyistic work.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that sounds right. One more question, and then I will let you
Yeah.
go. Um, Here's something you and I have both been thinking about recently. Taylor Swift.
Hmm. Yeah.
So how does she fit? Because it seems a fraught case, right? There's been the whole, for a few years, the Gaylor movement, which is sort of conspiracy theory-esque, that some of her lyrics are queer coded, and there's a question of whether she's queer baiting with those lyrics, as to trying to develop a queer audience by sort of using coded language but not actually um being queer herself. And she'd just written a piece recently about how, due to all of the negative publicity she had with respect to her dating life, she sort of surrounded herself with women, and that sort of is what led to some of the Gaylor rumors. And so, I mean,
Yeah,
she seems like a difficult or at least interesting case we're thinking about, and this is something you're writing on. And so I just wanted to invite you to
yeah.
say some of your thoughts on it.
So yeah, so Taylor Swift is an interesting case in lots of different ways. There's just Taylor Swift as ally, and whether or not she's actually a good ally, which is itself a fairly complicated question, because she's sort of, and we're talking about her pretty much as a queer ally here, not sort of in other realms. I I think those are different assessments. And there's you sort of have to look to the community, but also look to the things the community would look towards. She has featured on the massive Eras tour. She featured a significant number of queer opening acts. So she's platforming artists and giving them a chance to develop an audience. So like that seems like something that like would sort of be like, yeah, that seems like an allyistic behavior. Um, but she's also been relatively quiet given the size of her platform in response to a fair number of anti-LGBTQ laws that have passed over the last, 3 to 5 years. She hasn't had a lot to say on that. And that's sort of like it seemed like, well, how much of an ally is she? Like is she sort of putting capitalism above her allyship? Is that a fair question? Is like it seems like a fair question. It's hard to know. Like if I were Taylor Swift, I would probably play my cards pretty close to the vest as well. Like there's a lot going on with her having to do with like her level of fame that makes these questions tough. So there's that level of just to what degree is she an ally? Because if she's not an ally, then we're not necessarily going to have the intention that we need for a work of ally aesthetics in the first place. Um, then there's the second level of she like the work I'm like working on is her song "You Need to Calm Down." It's the most sort of obvious um, song or work of hers that seems to be directly dealing with something that you would think to be allyship. And it's a complicated case itself, in part because like community response to it has been mixed. There has been some like embrace of it, some rejection of it. There's also context around it. Like the video featured several queer creators and queer artists in the video with her, which is sort of doing things that you would expect of a good work of ally aesthetics, is to be trying to avoid co-opting and to be sort of giving people a platform. But the song itself is also fairly milk toast. Um, its advocacy is it's fairly benign. Um, Given some of the sort of the when you consider the vitriol and hate that queer people face, sort of just telling people to calm down, um, and sort of comparing her own sort of feud with Katy Perry to anti-LGBTQI plus hate sort of undermines the message a little bit in a way that the community hasn't always like that. Like I've, because I'm researching this, they've sort of rejected it in certain ways. But there's also just the fact that given her audience, which particularly coming out of country can often be somewhat more conservative white women. I think more so at that point in her career now. I think her audience has gotten larger and a little bit more varied. That sort of more sort of less in your face message might have been more effective. I can sort of say from personal anecdote, like one of my good friends told me like her mom was watching the video for her and was like, "Oh, those are drag queens. Do you know what those are?" And she was like, yeah, mom, I know what drag queens are. She's like, isn't that nice? It's like, all right, so if you have this audience that sort of you can sort of take baby steps with, that might actually be a more effective version of advocacy than something that would be much stronger. And so it's really interesting to think about what level of rejection is going to undermine any possibility of success, and what message, like, she's walking a line between the community she's advocating for and the community she's advocating to, which, given her audience, is really interesting. And as for the Gaylor stuff, on my view, if you're a member of the community, we're not going to sort of treat you in quite the same way in terms of worries about co-opting someone else's voice. But someone who is, at this point, at most cryptically revealed any level of queerness, like, seems mostly to be identifying as straight, has, my understanding is, recently sort of responded to the Gaylor stuff, or at least her people did, sort of trying to dampen it. But if she actually is queer, then some of the concerns are that we're going to worry about are different. And we're not going to be thinking about it. We're not going to be thinking about it as a work of ally aesthetics at all, really. If she reveals that she is queer, then it is a work of aesthetics by a member of the community. But so yeah, at the moment though, I myself have not been swayed by the cryptic lyrics to treat her as clearly out. I think that if that is sort of the positionality that she wants to occupy, that's on her to sort of reveal more directly.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Well, I look forward to reading that whenever it comes out, and I hope
Yeah,
others do too, because
yeah,
it's going
it's
to be
fun to
awesome.
write. I feel a little bit like an imposter talking about Taylor Swift. With you, I know that you're much deeper into the Swifty knowledge than I am, but
No, you did perfectly fine. Like I wave my Swifty wand at you, and you are hereby okay. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much. This was an absolutely delightful discussion. This was great. So thank you.
yeah, I loved it. Thank you so much.
Awesome.